Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed for the final installment in this series, Things Nvidia Needs to Fix. Previously, we discussed things that Tim and myself felt AMD and Intel needed to address. Now it's time to focus on the green team. Since we do have quite a bit to talk about here, I won't give you a whole rundown on the previous two episodes. If you're interested in those and you did miss them, then the links will be available below. As with the previous videos, we're looking at this from your perspective, the perspective of a consumer. So let's get into it. After the GTX 970 fiasco, we thought Nvidia would want to play it cool with the GeForce 10 series, but I guess with it being one of the best-selling GPUs of all time, they clearly didn't see the need. Nvidia started off strong in May of 2016 with the GTX 1080, followed up by the 1070 in June, and then in July the 1060. It was a strong lineup covering the $250, $400, and $600 US price points. Then in late 2016, Nvidia threw us a curveball with the 3GB 1060, a new model featuring half as much VRAM, which in itself wasn't a particularly big deal. However, what was a big deal was the fact that they disabled an SM unit, taking the CUDA-core count from 1280 down to 1152. This meant despite having the exact same name, it actually featured 10% fewer cores. Calling the 3GB model a GTX 1060 was extremely misleading, given that the specs only suggested the VRAM capacity had been changed and not the core count. Ideally, Nvidia really should have called that model a GTX 1050 Ti before the 1050 Ti was launched in October. Admittedly though, this isn't something I pulled Nvidia up hard enough on at the time. I've since called them out a few times about it, but I regret not making more noise about this in our day one coverage. It seems Nvidia didn't really care about the negative feedback they received from some reviewers and many customers, as they went on to later release a 5GB 1060, and although that model does have all the cores enabled, the reduced memory capacity in this case also means less memory bandwidth, and therefore less performance. Then more recently, they also released a 3GB version of the GTX 1050, which has less bandwidth than the original 2 and 4GB models. So we want to see Nvidia do better here moving forwards and just stop with the misleading product names, and we personally will make much more of an effort to push back against this anti-consumer practice. Now, if you thought we missed the whole GT 1030 fiasco when discussing the misleading product names, well, we didn't. It's just that this one is so bad that we felt it deserved its own category. The 3GB version of the GTX 1060 certainly was misleading and should have never happened, but for around 20% less than the 6GB version, those playing at 1080p should only see about a 7% dip in performance, so at least in terms of value, it is actually pretty good. Again, we're not trying to justify anything by saying that, we're merely noting that it's not actually a bad value product. However, what Nvidia has recently pulled with the GT 1030 really is disgusting. There's no other way to put it. Although the core configuration hasn't been touched, as was the case with the GTX 1060 3GB, the performance has been severely crippled by swapping out the GDDR5 memory with DDR4 memory, the stuff that modern desktop PCs use as system memory. The end result is almost 3 times less memory bandwidth, dropping down from an already anemic 48GB per second to just 16.8GB per second. This means that in memory intensive workloads, in other words games, the new DDR4 version is often 1 to 2 times slower, and it's not half the price either. It's like $10 cheaper, just $10. This is incredibly deceitful by Nvidia, and the risk to gamers on a tight budget is extreme. And while it's unfair to take advantage of anyone, robbing those struggling the most to get into gaming really is disgusting in our opinion. I could go on and on about this one, but for now let's just move on as there are a few more things we need to discuss. With the release of the GeForce 10 series, Nvidia announced the Founders Edition, a sexy looking reference card that no one should have bought, and we said as much in our day one coverage. In terms of quality, the Founders Edition models aren't bad. Thermals leave a little bit to be desired, but overall the build quality is good and they look quite nice. Personally, I don't actually have too much of an issue with the FE cards, but many of you have asked me to include this one in the video, so I have. And I can certainly understand where you're all coming from. Nvidia do charge a premium for their inferior reference design graphics cards, and let's be honest that the FE models are just reference design cards. And the real problem is that they often make them the only choice for early adopters. And they do this for the first few weeks, which in my opinion is Nvidia yet again taking advantage of their most loyal customers. That said, I should just quickly point out that you do have the option to wait and get a board partner card at a cheaper price, and a board partner card that offers better thermals and all that sort of stuff. And this is what we recommended you do in our day one GTX 1080 review. Unfortunately though, if you are after a Titan model, then you will be forced to buy a reference card from Nvidia. So on that note, it would be good to see Nvidia open up the Titan series to their board partners to make custom designed versions of that card. But probably more important than that, we would just like to see that the board partner cards are included in all the day one launches. As I said, this one isn't too much of an issue for us, but we would like to see Nvidia allow their partners to offer custom design cards on launch day, much like what they did with the GTX 1070 Ti release, for example. Speaking of the GTX 1070 Ti, we would like Nvidia to stop drip feeding us new GPUs. I mean, sure, release a new generation over the course of a few months if you must, but after that, just stop it with the unnecessary cut-down models that share the same names as the fully fledged parts. Stop it with GPUs that we don't need that just clutter up the product line, and stop rolling your most loyal customers in the process. We've already talked about the dodgy cut-down model, so there's no need to go over all that again. And as for releasing models we don't really need late in a product cycle, such as the GTX 1070 Ti, it's not terrible, but it can confuse people. The big issue with releasing so many products within the same series is Nvidia always ends up tripping over themselves, and in the process they just burn their most loyal gaming customers. If you bought a Titan X, for example, in late 2016, you're probably feeling pretty good about yourself. 40% more CUDA cores than the flagship GeForce part just made it a complete and utter beast. Of course, you're also paying twice the price, so it made absolutely no sense in terms of cost per frame, but still, it was the undisputed king. 7 months later though, Nvidia were like, I hope you enjoyed those bragging rights, because we're offering basically the same product for $500 US less. Then a month after that, they were like, are you upset about the GTX 1080 Ti yet? No? Still in denial, huh? Well, how about a Titan X little p? The P is for taking the piss edition. We're adding 7% more CUDA cores, and we're going back to charging $1,200 US. How about that? Oh, and if you're a Star Wars fan, it might have paid to wait a further 6 months for the Titan XP Collector's Edition. It's not easy being an Nvidia fan with deep pockets. Seriously though, that's some pretty amazing high-end early adopter abuse right there. This one is a bit tricky to tackle because Nvidia can and will only charge as much as they can. So if you're going to pay $1,000 US for a graphics card, they're going to charge you that much, and it's kind of hard to pull them up on it. We also have to contend with cryptocurrency mining, and we've seen how that can just blow the demand for GPUs to the point, blow up the demand for GPUs to the point where just AMD and Nvidia's MSRPs mean nothing at all. Back in 2010, Nvidia were charging just $500 US for their flagship part, the GeForce GTX 480. They did the same with the GTX 580, but later released the $700 GTX 590, and it was at that point that they probably realized that they could charge gamers much more for high-end graphics cards. By the time the GTX 600 series launched in 2012, they were well aware of that fact, and we got the GTX 690 for $1,000 US. It made no sense whatsoever, but for that price, they still sold. So with confirmation that Nvidia could sell $1,000 US graphics cards to gamers that made no sense, in 2013, the Titan range was born, and this helped them to justify a $700 US asking price for the flagship GeForce part. You could probably say that the Titan Z was somewhat of an experiment to see just how much some people would pay for bragging rights, though it was also a compute-heavy product, so maybe justified. So, armed with all that information, the Pascal Titan series climbed to $1,200 US, and now gamers everywhere are in fear of how much the next generation models are going to cost. Some much needed competition from AMD will certainly help here, but even so, the days of $500 US flagship gaming GPUs are well and truly over. So while we would very much like to see GPU prices calm down, and we beg that Nvidia not take advantage of the current situation they find themselves in, the reality is they will. So not sure where that leaves us on that one. First, just let me start by saying I don't think the GameWorks program is quite as bad as some would have you believe, but there have certainly been some underhanded tactics that need to stop. Firstly, for those of you unaware, GameWorks is an assortment of proprietary technologies that Nvidia provides developers, allowing them to include cutting-edge effects such as realistic hair, destruction, and shadows, and it allows them to do all these things without having to create them from scratch. However, Nvidia seems to often go out of their way, let's say, to make sure these effects are done in a way that makes them perform poorly on AMD GPUs. And sometimes they do this at the expense of their own GeForce customers. We have seen evidence in the past of technologies clearly being abused with the intention of giving Nvidia an advantage. For example, the use of tessellation in Crysis and The Witcher 3. This situation has caused backlash from gamers, even those using Nvidia hardware, as these dirty tricks do often hurt the performance of GeForce graphics cards. We've seen examples where Nvidia will take an unnecessarily large performance hit rather than optimize an effect, and they do this to ensure the performance hit for AMD is even greater. Nvidia, of course, denies these claims, but we've seen some pretty hard evidence that this is indeed going on. Upon release, we noticed a massive performance hit using both AMD and Nvidia hardware when benchmarking The Witcher 3 with Hairworks enabled. I reported a 55% reduction in performance for the GTX 980, but a 67% drop for the Radeon R9 290. With Hairworks disabled, the GTX 980 was still 16% faster than the R9 290. That's a significant win there for Nvidia. But with Hairworks enabled, the GeForce GPU was now 56% faster. There were a few issues with this though. Firstly, the GameWorks feature meant that GTX 980 owners were going from a minimum of just over 60 FPS at 1080p with Hairworks disabled to less than 30 FPS with it enabled. This actually led us at the time to recommend that no one use Hairworks at all. However, it was later discovered that Nvidia were abusing their tessellation performance advantage at the expense of their own GeForce customers. Again, we were seeing another excessive use case. By default, the tessellation level was set to times 64, despite the fact that no real visual difference could be seen between times 16 and times 64, even when analyzing screenshots, side by side. In fact, times 16 was barely any better than times 8, while times 8 was really only slightly better than times 4, and then by the time you drop it down to times 2, that did make the effect look quite poor. Reducing the tessellation level from times 64 to times 16 more than doubled the frame rates for scenes that made heavy use of Hairworks effects, while times 8 boosted performance by a further 20%. In short, using tessellation times 8 provided basically the same visuals with very little impact on performance, opposed to not using the technology at all. You can't really get away with blaming the developer on this one either, which is why we've pretty much just pinned the blame straight on Nvidia, because it is well documented that Nvidia worked very closely with the Witcher 3 team. So from my point of view, it's either sabotage or it's incompetence. So either way, they really do need to do better, and we want to stop seeing examples of GameWorks technologies being used to hurt the competition opposed to enriching the gaming experience. We've also seen much more recent examples of unjustifiably large performance hits in GameWorks titles, though thankfully we're all very well aware of what seems to be going on. So as a result, the Final Fantasy 15 issues were sorted out quite quickly after the initial benchmarking was complete. The developer on that one seemed quite happy to take the blame, so perhaps it was just an honest mistake. I didn't give AMD a hard time over driver support, and I'm not going to give Nvidia a hard time either. Sometimes display drivers aren't as good as they could be, but I feel overall for the most part both companies do a pretty good job. After all, ensuring that the current generation of GPUs as well as quite a few of the previous generations work in a massive range of games can't be an easy job, so I'm going to cut them a bit of slack on that one. That said, I will still do a bit of nitpicking and I'm going to target the GeForce Experience. The software can be quite clunky at times and in many ways does feel outdated. However, my biggest issue is the fact that Nvidia makes you sign in to use the software, and in my opinion that's just totally unnecessary. Of course, this isn't a new thing. Nvidia made this change quite a few years ago now, and we probably didn't push back hard enough at the time. I also am aware that some of you may not see this as a big deal or an issue worth raising at all, and it's true that you probably only have to manually log in every now and then. Even so, I feel like if you're forking out hundreds and hundreds of dollars for a GeForce GPU, that was really enough to have to avoid handing over your details. This one can certainly be viewed as nitpicking, and technically the GeForce Experience is optional software, but I just feel it would have been a nice gesture for Nvidia to offer it to their customers with no strings attached. Right, so if you're watching this video, you've probably heard of the GeForce Partner Program, or GPP. If not, here's a quick refresher. Nvidia tried to get all of their partners like ASUS, Gigabyte, MSI, and so on to sign a document called the GeForce Partner Program that would impose heavy restrictions on these companies. The bad parts of the document, which was leaked earlier this year by Kyle of Hard OCP, suggested that if a company didn't align their gaming brands exclusively with GeForce, they would no longer receive important development funds and other incentives. This is another one of those anti-competitive and anti-consumer moves that Nvidia just seems to enjoy making from time to time. Rather than simply producing compelling products and going about business fairly, Nvidia feels the need to shut out their competitors using underhanded tactics. GeForce graphics cards, particularly at the high end, are already better buys, and Nvidia holds far more market share than AMD, so it's just bizarre that Nvidia continually feels the need to bury competitors using shady tactics. Just stop doing this sort of rubbish, Nvidia. Put your products out there, let them compete on their own merits, and if they're good, they'll win over the consumers. If you don't do shady deals like the GPP in the background, you'll regain the trust of consumers, and you'll be genuinely seen as being on the side of gamers. There'll be no need to post clearly garbage statements on your website about how these dodgy deals benefit gamers and are all about transparency. Just play fair, play nice, and ultimately do the right thing for consumers. GSync is another one of those things that is frustrating for buyers and really only serves to line Nvidia's pockets with more cash. Now, what GSync brings to monitors is actually pretty good. Adaptive sync support, mandatory low frame rate compensation, monitor validation, and so forth. You can buy a GSync monitor and know you're getting something quality. But the way Nvidia has implemented GSync is anti-consumer and just plain unfriendly to all buyers. GSync requires a dedicated hardware module, and that module only works with Nvidia graphics cards. The module is also fairly costly, adding approximately $200 US to the price of any given monitor. This means any Nvidia GPU owner wanting to buy a GSync monitor needs to spend an additional $200 US compared to an AMD GPU owner that has access to very similar FreeSync technology for free. That sucks for those who have bought Nvidia's GPUs. They have to spend an additional $200 more because FreeSync doesn't work with Nvidia cards. And there's no reason why Nvidia GPUs can't support FreeSync, other than the fact that Nvidia wants to be greedy and lock out their customers from competing technologies. FreeSync is an open standard. In fact, it's basically just Visa Adaptive Sync, so Nvidia is free, very free to implement support whenever they like and give Nvidia GPUs access to cheaper adaptive sync monitors. But they don't, of course, because they can force gamers into buying GSync monitors while locking AMD owners out of GSync and making it harder to switch GPU ecosystems. It's another frustrating anti-consumer move from Nvidia, and one we'd like to see change. So that was a long one and not terribly enjoyable. We just discussed more than half a dozen things that we as consumers feel Nvidia needs to address. Again, this is merely a wish list, if you will. We don't expect that Nvidia will address any of these concerns. We're nowhere near that naive, but it would be great to see them address a few of these things over the next year or so. Although this content piece has been almost entirely negative, it's not to say that Nvidia hasn't released some truly amazing products with their GeForce 10 series, because they absolutely have. We love the GTX 1080 Ti as an example. We love a lot of the GeForce cards. The 1080 Ti is an incredible flagship GPU, and we use it for pretty much all our benchmarking. And again, we like the bulk of the Pascal lineup, which makes products such as the GT 1030 DDR4 version all the more disappointing. Anyway, despite all the negativity, I hope you guys did enjoy the video, and the entire series for that matter. Hopefully, if we decide to revisit this series next year, we'll have less to complain about from all three companies. As always, thanks for watching, and I look forward to reading your thoughts in the comment section down below. I'm your host, Steve, and I will see you next time.